Hey guys, tonight we drift into the cloisters, though not the hushed and solemn corridors you might expect. Instead, you catch a whiff of yeast, toasted grain, and something faintly floral, wafting from a heavy oak door that opens not onto a chapel, but a kitchen. The image feels warm and bustling, aprons tied tight, sleeves rolled, copper kettles steaming. Nuns move quietly, but with the purposeful rhythm of practiced craft. You almost forget this is a convent, not a medieval brewery. And you probably wouldn't survive trying to match their daily workload, so don't even think about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the spread of night owls, insomniacs, and cozy early to bed dreamers tuning in from across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the cloister courtyard, but your attention keeps slipping back to the kitchens, where the real pulse of the convent beats. Meals don't cook themselves, and beer, yes, beer, has to be brewed, monitored, tasted, and barreled. The idea of women in veils, clattering pots, and checking mash temperatures might not be the postcard you expect from a convent, but this was the reality. Convents were not just houses of prayer, they were engines of self-sufficiency. You imagine hauling water from a well, heavy and sloshing, carried in wooden pails that splash over your sandals. The brewing sisters, practical to the core, line up ingredients: barley from local fields, herbs picked from the convent garden, sometimes rye or oats if supplies were thin. Brewing wasn't exotic, it was as ordinary and necessary as baking bread. In fact, it was considered part of daily sustenance, a form of liquid bread. One mainstream fact worth remembering: in medieval Europe, beer was often safer to drink than water. Wells and rivers could be contaminated with waste, and boiling during the brewing process killed harmful microbes, though no one knew what microbes were. They just knew beer didn't give you stomach cramps as often as water did. Historians still argue whether this was intentional knowledge or happy accident, but the outcome mattered. Beer kept communities alive. Here's where it gets quirky. Some convents brewed not only for themselves, but also in almost industrial quantities, rivaling nearby monasteries. The quiet sisterhood suddenly looks more like a well-organized brewery crew. You picture one sister hefting a stirring paddle taller than herself, muscles hidden beneath her habit. Another checks the firewood, ensuring a steady flame under the mash tun. In the background, a novice scrubs clay jugs, muttering about sticky residue left behind from the last batch. And in the air, always that mingling of yeast and damp straw, a perfume of survival. You trail along a passageway lined with barrels, cool and shadowed. Each cask represents not just nourishment, but careful planning. Beer had to last through winters, through fasts, through feast days, when the convent population swelled with visiting pilgrims. You pause by one barrel, run your hand along the staves, and imagine the patient labor it took to craft not only the beer inside, but the very container that held it. Now here's a little joke tucked into history's folds. For a cloistered life devoted to contemplation and chastity, medieval nuns sure spent a suspicious amount of time perfecting alcohol. You can't help but think they might have been the original work hard, play hard types, though, of course, their play was probably more like solemn sipping than medieval karaoke. Still, their work wasn't without spiritual resonance. Brewing was an act of care, of providing health and safety in liquid form. Many sisters saw it as a humble service, almost prayer in motion. Every stir of the mashtun, every cleaned jug, every poured pint, these were threads woven into the tapestry of devotion. And yet, practical life persisted. Chores never stopped at prayer bells. Chickens needed feeding, gardens needed weeding, and beer needed brewing. If you were a nun, you might spend as much time among kettles as you did in chapel pews. In some orders, brewing was considered no less holy than copying manuscripts or tending the sick. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The splash of water poured over grain, the crackle of a fire beneath iron pots, the murmur of Latin prayers bleeding into the hum of everyday labor, a paradox of silence and industry, cloisters and kitchens, devotion and fermentation. The convent was alive, not with ethereal chants alone, but with the grounded rhythms of survival. You settle deeper into the story as the convent's daily rhythm folds around you, and soon you notice that beer isn't some occasional luxury here. It's the backbone of daily nourishment. Bread fills your stomach, but ale keeps you alive. It's a peculiar reality, one you might chuckle at now, imagining a nun lifting her mug at breakfast. But for them, beer was safer than water, and often just as important as bread itself. You picture yourself at a long wooden table in the refectory, a clay mug in hand, steam curling faintly from its surface even in the cool morning. The taste is malty, a little sour, not quite the crisp lager you buy today, but hearty, filling like liquid grain porridge in a friendlier form. Mainstream fact: medieval Europeans often drank small beer, a low alcohol brew consumed daily, even by children. Stronger ales existed, of course, but the everyday stuff was light enough that you could down it with porridge without toppling over in a holy stupor. Historians still argue whether medieval people were constantly tipsy or if their bodies adjusted to the steady, gentle buzz. But the fact remains: beer was the drink of necessity, not indulgence. The quirk comes when you realize just how central ale was to survival. In some convents, nuns received a ration of beer every single day, sometimes 2 or 3. Imagine the daily planner of a 12th century nun. Matins at dawn, brewing by mid-morning. Vespers at dusk, 3 pints of ale sprinkled in between. You can't help but smirk. Modern nutrition apps would have a meltdown trying to log that. The kitchens, the cellars, the cool stone storage rooms all revolved around this cycle of brewing and drinking. You pass a row of clay mugs, identical except for faint nicks in the rim, each assigned to a sister. Sharing mugs was frowned upon. Sanitation mattered, even if the word didn't exist yet. The mugs smell faintly sour, the glaze darkened from years of use. You trail your fingers over their edges and imagine the sisters lifting them at nearly every meal. Now consider this twist. Beer was often written into contracts and payments. Laborers sometimes received part of their wages in ale. If you had fields rented out to tenants, you might accept bushels of barley and a few gallons of brewed beer as payment. And in convents, where resources had to be carefully balanced, beer became a currency of sorts. Liquid wealth sloshing in barrels stacked neatly in the cellar. One nun, stout and wiry, ladles frothy ale into mugs with the solemnity of a banker counting coins. Another takes careful notes on a wax tablet, marking how many pints are owed to which worker. And while monks down the road might mutter over their own ledgers, the sisters knew their brew wasn't just sustenance. It was accounting, economics, and survival rolled into one. Here comes the first light joke. Imagine if your utility bill today came with an option to pay in 6-pack installments. The power company might finally get friendlier. For the nuns, though, this wasn't hypothetical. It was lived reality. You stroll into the garden, hearing the faint echo of the chapel bell. But even as the sisters file to prayer, their minds still orbit around barrels cooling in the cellars. Brewing wasn't an occasional side hobby. It was embedded in every rhythm, every decision. To run out of beer was unthinkable, like letting the bread ovens go cold. And the drink itself, yes, it carried calories, sometimes enough to sustain people through fasting periods. There are records of communities relying almost entirely on ale during Lent, when solid foods were restricted. Picture yourself trying to fast from food while still sipping pints of hearty, grain-heavy beer. You'd survive technically, though your spiritual reflections might wobble a bit after your third mug of liquid bread. Historians still debate whether medieval beer contained enough nutrition to truly replace meals, but convent records suggest it was treated that way. Brewing wasn't a distraction from devotion. It was devotion. It was sustaining the body so the soul could keep praying. In the convent's dim refectory, you can almost see it. Sisters lifting mugs in unison, lips pressing to clay rims, heads bowing briefly before they drink. Silence rules the meal, but the ale keeps conversation unnecessary. It fills bellies, soothes throats, and sustains weary bodies through long vigils and colder nights. And somewhere between the steamy kitchens and the chill cellars, you realize beer was not just a drink, it was a constant companion, the invisible backbone of life, proof that holiness and practicality weren't at odds. The nuns prayed with one hand and brewed with the other, stitching together a survival plan one mug at a time. You drift forward in the narrative and find yourself in a low-roofed brewing room, its air thick with steam and the grassy tang of fresh herbs. A sister leans over a wide copper kettle, tossing in handfuls of dried plants. Some you recognize, others you don't. The scent is sharp, a little medicinal, almost like a medieval apothecary collided with a kitchen. This is where you discover that the story of Nun Brewed beer isn't just about barley and water, but about hops, herbs, and the tug of war between tradition and innovation. Mainstream fact. Hops, the bittering agent that defines most modern beer, weren't universally adopted in Europe until around the 14th and 15th centuries. Before that, brewers, especially women brewers, often called alewives, used a mix of herbs known as gruit. Think yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, sage, sometimes even juniper. Each convent had its own recipe, a signature flavor handed down like a family secret. Historians still argue whether hops were resisted because they changed the flavor too much, or because hopping the brew shifted profits away from those who controlled grute taxes. Either way, you watch the nuns stand right in the middle of this debate, brewing with a confidence that feels quietly rebellious. One quirky detail: some convent records mention herbs chosen not just for flavor, but for their temperance of the humors. One sister might insist that a pinch of sage cooled excess bile, while another swore bog, myrtle soothed melancholy. You can almost hear their banter. "Sister Agnes, your brew makes me drowsy." "Good, Sister Margaret. That means it's working." You chuckle, imagining medieval Yelp reviews complaining about too much wormwood in the finish. You lean closer to the kettle and the steam fogs your vision. The brew inside bubbles softly, flecks of green drifting on the surface. A novice kneels by the hearth, stoking the fire, sweat dripping down her brow. It's hard work, heavy lifting, constant stirring, and you think about how many calories must have been burned just to make the drink that would later replace the calories burned. Brewing, in other words, was a full-body workout. CrossFit, Cloister Edition. Light joke number 2 floats in. If fitness influencers today sold medieval brewing classes, they'd market it as hot kettle cardio, burn calories while boiling barley. You picture rows of gym goers swinging mash paddles instead of kettlebells. But behind the laughter is a serious truth. These sisters experimented. They knew herbs by touch, taste, and season. Some herbs mellowed the bitterness, others heightened it, and still others added unexpected side effects. One convent's brew might be calming, another stimulating, another's just plain questionable. Imagine walking into a tavern window run by nuns and thinking, "Better not have 2 mugs of theirs unless I want to sleep through tomorrow's prayers." The debate over hops creeps back into your mind. Hops preserved beer longer, letting it travel farther without souring. For monasteries with big distribution ambitions, hops were a godsend. For small convents, though, herbs were local, personal, tied to their gardens and identity. Historians still debate whether convents resisted hops because they clung to tradition, or whether they simply didn't have access to large hop fields like monks did. Either way, when you sip the brew in your imagination, it tastes more like an herbal tonic than the crisp bitterness of a modern IPA. As the steam clears, you notice shelves lined with clay jars, each marked with chalk. Sage, rosemary, wormwood, yarrow. The convent garden, tended daily with calloused hands, was as important to brewing as the barley fields beyond. You picture a nun crouched in the dirt, clipping herbs with shears, muttering a prayer as she fills her basket. Brewing began in the soil, under the sun, long before it ever reached the kettle. And here's where you smile again. For a cloister sworn to silence, the convent garden must have buzzed with quiet gossip, herb baskets serving as excuses for whispered debates about recipes. You can almost hear it. Do we add wormwood this year? Only if you want Sister Clara to scowl at us again. The kettle boils, foam rising dangerously close to the rim. A sister rushes forward, skimming it with practiced hands, keeping the froth from spilling. This is serious business. To brew well was to secure nourishment, income, and reputation. To brew poorly was to waste grain and herbs in a world where nothing could be wasted. And so every leaf of sage mattered, every root pulled from the earth. You glance back at the shelves and your eyes settle on a jar labeled simply lupulus, hops. It's there tucked among the herbs, a sign that change is seeping into the convent walls. You know that one day hops will dominate, Groot will fade, and beer will never taste the same again. But for now, you breathe in the mingled perfume of herbs and hops, an in-between world where nuns brewed better not because they clung to one method, but because they knew how to weave old and new together in every bubbling batch. You wander deeper into the convent's cool underbelly, where the air grows damp and shadows stretch long across stone floors. Here, among rows of barrels stacked like sentinels, you find the sisters' other vocation, accounting with froth. Brewing wasn't just art and prayer, it was mathematics, logistics, and the careful management of resources. In this dim cellar, you can almost hear the scratching of styluses on wax tablets, the counting of barrels, and the low mutter of nuns adding sums under their breath. Mainstream fact: medieval convents kept meticulous records of their beer production, not unlike monasteries. Ledgers tracked how much grain went into brewing, how many barrels were filled, and where those barrels ended up. Beer was measured, tallied, rationed, and sometimes taxed. Historians still argue whether these records were simply practical notes or a form of proto-accounting that shaped later European bookkeeping practices. Either way, the convent brewmasters doubled as accountants. The quirky bit lies in how beer often appeared in unexpected corners of the ledger. A payment for a mason repairing the chapel wall might read, 2 gallons of ale plus bread. A scribe illuminating a psalter might receive his wage partly in liquid form. Beer wasn't just food, it was currency, capable of patching roofs and buying labor. Imagine today's spreadsheets filled not with dollar signs, but with tiny beer mug icons next to every entry. You grin at the thought. Excel, medieval edition. A sister stands with quill in hand, balancing on a stool beside a towering barrel. She dips a slender rod into the cask, pulls it out dripping, and marks a notch on her tablet. Another nun carefully adds lines, her habit dusted faintly with flour, suggesting she just came from the kitchen. These women multitasked before the word existed, flipping between prayer, brewing, baking, and bookkeeping as seamlessly as you swipe between apps. Here comes your light joke. If multitasking burned calories, medieval nuns could have outpaced any modern fitness tracker. Picture a Fitbit buzzing constantly. Congratulations, Sister Agnes. You've stirred 10,000 steps worth of mash today. The cellar itself feels like a treasury. Cool stone walls keep the barrels at a stable temperature, preventing spoilage. Each cask represents a unit of wealth, a week of sustenance, a contract fulfilled. The sisters walk among them with reverence, touching staves as if they were relics. Brewing was survival, but record-keeping turned it into a kind of economy, invisible but powerful. You lean closer to one wax tablet, its surface etched with neat rows, tally marks, symbols for gallons, cryptic shorthand that only the scribe herself could decode. It's not glamorous, but it's strangely soothing, the slow, methodical work of making sense of a world measured in barrels and mugs. And the debates echo through time. Historians still argue whether nuns were better at this beer math than monks, since convent records show fewer shortages and spoilages. Was it sharper management or just luck? You'll never know, but the thought lingers as you trace your finger over the ghostly notches on an old cask. A novice appears balancing two small clay jugs and waits patiently as the cellar keeper tallies her request. The jug is filled, the mark recorded, the novice dismissed. It's a rhythm as steady as the brewing cycle itself. Measure, dispense, record, repeat. And you begin to notice how this rhythm ties the whole convent together. Brewing wasn't only about flavor or nourishment, it was about stability. The cellar was both pantry and bank, its barrels rolling silently through the economy of daily life. Without these calculations, prayers might still rise, but bellies would growl, and the convent's fragile balance would collapse. You picture yourself seated at a rough wooden bench, quill in hand, trying to keep pace with the numbers. Ink blots stain your fingers. The smell of beer seeps from the casks behind you, and in the flickering candlelight you realize brewing may have filled the mugs, but counting every drop kept the convent alive. You climb back into the daylight, leaving behind the cool hush of the beer cellar, and you overhear something sharper than prayer chants. Whispers of rivalry. Brewing, after all, wasn't gender-neutral territory. It was an arena where men and women competed for skill, reputation, and control. In the towns outside the convent walls, male brewers were organizing themselves into guilds, exclusive, protective clubs that guarded recipes, fixed prices, and elbowed women out of the trade. But inside convent kitchens, the sisters brewed anyway, their kettles hissing in quiet defiance. Mainstream fact. By the late Middle Ages, brewing guilds began restricting women's access to professional brewing. In earlier centuries, brewing had been a household and often female-centered task. But as beer production scaled into urban industries, guilds sought to monopolize profits. Historians still argue whether this was a natural shift of labor as cities grew, or whether it was a deliberate attempt to squeeze women out of profitable trades. Either way, convent nuns kept right on brewing, shielded somewhat by their religious authority. The quirky detail comes when you realize how much resentment this brewed. Pun fully intended. Chronicles occasionally grumble about convent ales, outselling or outshining those of nearby monks or town guild members. Imagine a medieval Yelp review written in crabbed Gothic script. 3 stars. Monks ale watery. Nuns ale far too popular. You can almost see the monks clutching their mugs, muttering about unfair competition while secretly sneaking over for a taste. A light joke surfaces here. Picture a medieval version of today's craft beer wars, except instead of quirky hipster brewers with beards, you've got veiled sisters perfecting recipes behind cloister walls. No ironic tattoos, just calloused hands and very sharp opinions on bog myrtle. Step into the marketplace with me for a moment. You hear the cries of vendors, smell roasted chestnuts, feel the cobbles underfoot. In one corner, a guild brewer tries to hawk his wares, but the crowd drifts toward a tiny shuttered window in the convent wall, where a nun quietly serves frothing mugs. The townsfolk nod approvingly. The sisters' beer is smoother, tastier, and, some say, easier on the stomach the next day. Competition wasn't just theoretical. It played out sip by sip in the public's favor. The rivalry extended beyond taste. Brewing represented income, and income meant influence. For monasteries and guilds alike, losing customers to convents threatened their financial base. And here's where you sense the tension building. Brewing wasn't only a practical trade, it was a gendered battleground. The sisters' success whispered something unsettling into the ears of male brewers. Maybe women could do it better. Historians still argue whether nuns brewed out of necessity, just to supply their convents, or whether some houses deliberately expanded production to compete. The records blur, and you'll never pin down the full truth. But the image of veiled women stirring kettles while guild scribes fume over lost profits is hard to shake. Imagine standing in the convent courtyard, hearing distant chants from the chapel and closer laughter from the brewing room. Brewing was community, survival, even joy. The nuns brewed not to pick a fight with monks or guilds, but because it was their work, their sustenance. Still, rivalry blossomed in the space between their barrels and the monastery cask down the road. You lean against the convent stone wall, listening to the faint hum of bees in the herb garden. But beneath that quiet, you feel it, the tension of gender, economics, and reputation fermenting just as fiercely as the beer itself. The sisters never set out to prove superiority. They simply brewed, and in doing so, they brewed better. And so the rivalry lingers, half whispered in old records, half joked about in taverns. On one side of the wall, nuns with kettles, herbs, and patience. On the other, monks and guilds with quills, taxes, and envy. And you, standing right between them, realized this was more than a drink. It was a contest of who would hold the frothing crown of medieval beer. You follow the smell of malt to the outer wall, where a square of shadow breaks into a small, shuttered opening, barely big enough for a jug to pass through. A bell tinkles. A wooden slide pulls back. A veiled face appears behind iron lattice, and a line of townsfolk shuffles closer, coins ready. You realize you're watching one of the convent's quiet miracles. Surplus ale crossing from cloister to community, one ladle at a time, through a window that keeps enclosure intact and hospitality alive. It's half pantry, half portal, and all business. Mainstream fact. Across medieval Europe, local authorities regulated beer by the assize of bread and ale, which set prices and occasionally tested quality, especially in England. Town officers known as ale conners, or ale tasters, sampled brews to ensure they weren't too weak, too sour, or scandalously overpriced. You picture one such official approaching the convent window with professional solemnity, taking a sip as if knighting the foam, then giving a curt nod that sends relief rippling down the line. Historians still argue whether convents in strict enclosure orders sold directly to the public or relied on lay sisters and stewards to handle sales, but the result rings the same. Mugs are filled, and the street warms with chatter. The quirk sits in the window dressing. Many alehouses signaled fresh brew with an ale stake or a bush of greenery hung outside. You watch a lay sister, one of the conversae tasked with worldly errands, pin a little garland of hops near the shutter on brewing days. No neon sign, just a twist of vine that whispers, "Today's batch is ready." It's subtle and charming, and you can't help smiling at the medieval marketing. If ivy is good enough for wine, a hop curl can surely hint at excellent beer. As the queue inches forward, the choreography becomes clear. A wooden scoop passes out. A clay jug returns brimming. A small tally stick accepts a notch for credit or a clink for cash. A baker buys a gallon to reward apprentices after a long bake. A midwife collects a warmed jug for the nerves. A traveling scholar risks a joke in bad Latin and earns exactly 0 laughs from the businesslike sister behind the grill. The process is frictionless long before anyone invents the word frictionless. Light joke 1 arrives uninvited. This is essentially a medieval drive-through, except you walk, the window is smaller, and instead of paper straws, you get advice about your humors. "Too much collar," the sister murmurs, adding a calming herb to a customer's jug. "Also, pay your tab." You lean against the wall and feel the cool grit of stone through your sleeve, while the afternoon drifts into an easy rhythm. Pour, pass, notch, close. There's no hawking, no barked prices, just steady exchange. It fits the cloister's tone. Commerce here is careful, almost liturgical. The coins don't jangle so much as breathe, small exhalations of the town into the convent's lungs. And because the beer is consistently good, herb balanced, properly boiled, cleanly stored, the line keeps returning. Reputation, you realize, is its own granary. A mother produces a wooden token strung on a cord. The sister recognizes it at once and fills her jug. Quirky detail. In some places, parishes and houses used tokens for prepaid measures of ale at feast days. A kind of medieval punch card. You picture the token drawer inside, divided by sizes, half pint, pint, gallon, organized with the same calm ferocity the cellar keeper brings to her ledgers. If your last memory of accounting was the convent's Excel medieval edition, this is the plug-in. Smooth credit for trusted neighbors. Another official ambles up, the ale conner from earlier, wiping foam from his mustache with bureaucratic dignity. Light joke too flickers by. Imagine listing professional beer taster on your resume and having it be an actual civil service job. Influencers wish. He inspects the hop garland, peeks at the cooper's marks on a cask stave, and mutters something about fair measure. The sister meets his gaze with the serene expression of someone whose mash temperatures are impeccable. Inside the wall, you can sense the echo. The tally on wax, the marks on parchment, the rolling arithmetic of brew in, brew out. The sisters don't need to shout about quality. The window says it quietly dozens of times a day. And while monks across town might have scale and patrons, the nuns have proximity. The alley remembers their kindness. The market remembers their consistency. The children remember getting a sip of small beer on feast days and not waking up queasy. Your earlier joke about fewer hangovers taps you on the shoulder again. The public seems to think so too. Where does the money go? You drift after a lay sister carrying a leather pouch that ticks like a small clock. Into the almonry for bread and soup. Into the infirmary for linens and salves. Into the brew house for grain and wood. Brewing makes generosity scalable. You've seen the inside economy, barrels as bank accounts, and now you watch the outside economy answer back with coins that translate into care. You catch a rumor floating down the line. The parish is planning a church ale, a community fundraiser where food, music, and, of course, ale help repair roofs and mend roads. Mainstream fact: church ales were real fixtures in late medieval England, local festivals that blurred the line between merrymaking and municipal budgeting. Historians still argue whether convents commonly supplied these events or if parishes mostly relied on secular brewsters and guilds. But you can imagine casks from the sisters quietly anchoring the celebration with steady, honest flavor. Light joke 3 winks past as a customer drops coins into the scoop, then hesitates. Do you take contactless? The sister taps the tally stick. We've been going contactless for years. She means the revolving turn, a lazy, Susan-like drum some houses used for passing goods in and out without direct eye contact. You grin at the thought. Privacy, modesty, and logistics solved with clever carpentry. Evening draws on. The last jugs pass. The window shutters close with a thud that feels ceremonial. You stand a moment longer, breathing the warm afterscent of malt and wood smoke, and think about boundaries. The grill keeps enclosure intact, but the flow never really stops. Tomorrow, the window opens again. Next week, the hop garland goes up again. The town leans on the wall, and the wall quietly leans back. You remember the herb debates in the brewing room, the counting in the cellar, the rivalry in the marketplace, and see how this little square of darkness stitched them together. It's where experimentation meets accounting, where rivalry meets reputation, where prayer meets practice. If the cloister is a heart, the tavern window is an artery. Through it runs nourishment, trust, and the soft hum of a city that sleeps easier when the beer is clean. And just before you leave, you catch one more tiny ritual. The sister crosses the empty sill with 2 fingers, a motion so quick you almost miss it. Maybe gratitude, maybe habit, maybe a blessing for tomorrow's line. Historians still argue whether gestures like that were officially prescribed or just human reflex wrapped in faith. You decide it doesn't matter. The window will open, the mugs will fill, and the convent will keep its quiet promise, one ladle at a time. You drift back from the shuttered window into the warm thrum of the brewhouse and find the sisters in a small, satisfied debate. Yesterday's batch drew compliments. Smoother, gentler, didn't wake with a pounding head. You smile at the thought of medieval word-of-mouth reviews whispered after lauds. The sisters don't boast, they tinker. A pinch less wormwood, a breath more meadow sweet, a ginger shaving the size of a fingernail. You stand by the kettle and feel the steam gloss your skin while the garden scents mint, fennel, ale hoof filter in like a soft chorus. Mainstream fact: hops bring bitterness and preservation, but long before hopped beer took over, European brewers, especially household brewsters and religious women, seasoned ale with local herbs. Ground ivy, called ale huvarnes, was a favorite, used to clarify and stabilize the brew. Meadowsweet and yarrow were common too, shaping aroma and shelf life. When hops do arrive in force, they'll help beer keep longer and travel farther. But for now, the convent's strength is freshness, cleanliness, and herbs chosen to be kind to the body. Historians still argue whether Meadowsweet's salicylates in medieval strength ale truly eased headaches, or whether later readers romanticized a pleasant floral note into a pharmacology lecture. But you sense the sisters trust the evidence of experience. People feel better after drinking theirs. A novice brings over a woven basket and spreads its cargo on the table. Green fennel seeds that smell of licorice, ginger slivers with a bright, peppery sting, and a sprig of costmary. The Bible leaf, the one certain sisters keep tucked as a scented bookmark in their psalters. Quirky tidbit: costmary earned that nickname because readers pressed it between pages to keep them fresh and to wake drowsy minds. Here, the same leaf lifts a beer's nose and, the sisters swear, settles a fussy stomach. You rub the leaf and get a camphor mint snap, then watch it sink into the foam like a tiny canoe. The brew mistress, steady hands, wry smile, has a theory you can follow without charts. Fewer headaches begin with cooler cellars and gentler boils. She keeps the mash from scorching, uses a broad, shallow tub to cool the wort quickly, and insists on scrubbing every jug with hot water and ash lye until the clay squeaks. Clean vessels, happy yeast. Happy yeast, fewer harsh flavors. She doesn't have language for fusel alcohols and congeners. She has memory and taste. The ale that rests quietly and finishes clean leaves fewer complaints at the grill the next morning. Light joke one bubbles up. The convent is basically a medieval wellness brand, except the merch is kettles, the influencers wear veils, and the content is mostly how to skim your foam. You can almost hear a tutorial, welcome back to Barman Calm, where today we're clarifying with ale hoof, smash that bell, for fresh batches. You notice the choreography again. Grain crushed but not pulverized, water added in stages, the mash resting like a warm loaf under a blanket of steam. A sister dips a hand to test temperature with the confidence of someone who's held 1,000 mornings in her palm. Another prepares the barm, the froth of living yeast from a previous successful brew, coaxing it awake in a small bowl like a pet that knows exactly when to be charming. A portion of that barm will leaven tomorrow's bread. The rest will carry the new ale forward. Nothing is wasted, everything is fed. When the boil begins, aromas tilt from green and grassy to honeyed and warm. Meadow sweet slips in, almond soft, floral. Ginger follows, a little spark under the tongue. Fennel rides the steam like a ribbon. You taste the imagined sip. Round, herbal, quietly bitter at the edges with a clean finish that doesn't claw. Small beer strength for daily life. A little stronger for feast days. If yesterday's crowd was right, this will be the sort of pint that lets a mason meet the dawn without regretting the past. Light joke 2 leans on the doorframe. Somewhere, a monk is composing a stern letter about frivolous botanicals, pausing only to finish a second goblet of the same botanicals. You promise not to tell. Better recipes, the brewmistress says, are mostly better habits. She keeps records of which barrels slept in which corner of the cellar. The farther wall runs cooler, so summer ferments go there. She marks the staves with discrete symbols, rotates casks before flavors sag, taps with a breathable spile at first and a tight one later, listening to the tiny voice of each beer. Not yet. Not yet. Now. She trains novices to skim with a light hand, to trust their noses over any guess, and to believe that there are a dozen places to ruin a beer and a dozen small kindnesses that save it. You think of your own mornings, the ones that go wrong for no dramatic reason. just a stack of small neglects. The sister's answer is the opposite: a stack of small attentions, a careful fire, a clean jug, a leaf crushed at the right moment. You can't prove that this prevents headaches, but you can feel how it might. There's laughter in the room, the soft, contained kind that belongs in cloisters, as an elder sister tells the old ale conner story again. A taster in leather breeches sits on a bench smeared with beer, and if he sticks, the ale is too sugary or green. Maybe apocryphal, maybe not. Either way, it's a good yarn, and everyone chuckles at the image of a civil servant standing up with a plank attached. Light joke 3 carries it along. Imagine writing that into your report. Findings adhesive. Toward the back, a lay sister sets a small wooden sign beside a row of cooling jugs. Warm for the infirmary. You clock the gentle link between fewer headaches and healing. Today's herbs are not just flavor, they're heading straight for the bedside as well. You make a mental note to follow those jars next time, and you will, but for now, the kettle asks for your attention. Steam softens the edges of the room. The brew mistress tilts her head, listening to the boil like a musician tuning a string. She whispers a prayer you don't quite catch. Gratitude likely, and maybe a petition for tomorrow's grain to arrive on time. Then she lifts the paddle and moves it through the wort in slow arcs that look like calligraphy, as if she's writing kindness directly into the beer. Your shoulders drop. The air feels thick and gentle, like a warm cloak set over tired bones. You think back to the window at the wall, to the line of neighbors, to the quiet satisfaction on faces that sip and feel soothed. Clean water is rare. Clean beer is a gift. The sisters have found a way to make that gift less punishing, less sour, less chaotic, less likely to fight you in the morning. Maybe it's the herbs, maybe it's the clean jugs, maybe it's the calm confidence that seeps from their hands into the kettles. You don't need a theory to be grateful for the result. Evening slides in, the kettle rests, the wort cools in a low pan while a sister fans the air with measured patience. A honey light leans through the door and lays a quiet gold across the floor. If you listen closely, you can hear the future, faint and carbonating, ready to meet the next market day without drama. You smooth the crinkle from the costmary leaf and tuck it in your own pocket, your private bookmark for the rest of the night. Then turn toward the infirmary and the labeled jars awaiting their shift. The recipe that keeps heads clear might just keep fevers low, you'll see. You slip down the corridor toward the infirmary, following the little wooden placard you noticed earlier. Warm for the infirmary. And the faint clink of glass against clay. The air here is gentler, laced with lavender, rosemary, and the sweet bready hush of small beer kept just above cool. Shelves line the walls like quiet sentences, stoppered jars of dried leaves, little pots of salves, folded linens that smell faintly of sun, and a row of narrow-necked flasks the color of honey tea. The sisters move in a softer rhythm here, the briskness of the brewhouse smoothed into bedside patience. A novice cradles a jug. An elder sister tests the warmth of a cup with the inside of her wrist, nodding when it feels kind. Mainstream fact: medieval religious houses maintained infirmaries as part of their rule-bound duty, care of the sick before all else, as Benedictine tradition famously instructs. These rooms weren't just for the sisters. Many convents treated neighbors, travelers, and the poor. And ale, especially small, digestible ale, often doubled as a vehicle for medicine. Herbs that might be bitter or harsh in water became friendlier when coaxed into warm beer, served in sips that soothed the throat and settled the stomach. Historians still argue whether these medical ales were distinct recipes brewed specifically for healing, or simply ordinary batches steeped with extra botanicals at the bedside. But you watch the practice happen in real time. The beer you smelled in the brewhouse now whispers into cups as remedy. On a table by the window, a sister lays out today's additions: meadow sweet for easing aches, fennel for wind, a slice of ginger to wake appetite, and a pinch of betony. The darling of medieval herbals, praised for everything from headaches to clouded thoughts. Quirky tidbit: some herbals list so many uses for betony that the running joke became, sell your house and keep betony. which is exactly the kind of prescription that makes you side-eye the pharmacist and then brew the tea anyway. The infirmarian smiles as she crushes a leaf. Aroma rises like a memory of green hills. A woman from town sits on a low stool, eyes tired, hands restless. The sister asks a few questions, the kind you'd recognize across centuries. How long? Where does it hurt? Can you keep broth down? She adds a sliver of ginger to the cup, pours in warm small beer, and stirs with the kind of patience that makes the room itself exhale. Light joke one drifts in. You realize you're watching medieval room service, except instead of tiny hotel kettles, the cart holds a brew you helped smell at the kettle. And instead of a Wi-Fi password, you're handed a prayer and told to nap. At the far shelf, a row of clear flasks catches the light. Diagnostic bottles used for uroscopy. The sisters lift them, tilt them, compare colors against a little painted chart. Yes, really, a paint swatch for pee. Quirky, yes, but common. The goal is to read the body stories in shades of straw and amber. The infirmarian doesn't overpromise. She combines observations with common sense and a lot of clean water, broth, and rest. If appetite refuses to wake, a spoon or two of honey mixes into the warm ale. If nerves rattle Cosmery, remember the Bible leaf you tucked in your pocket, adds a mint camphor hush to the cup. Mainstream fact again? Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess, wrote medical works that folded food, herbs, and brewing into a worldview of humors and balance. She even noted that hops preserve drink and temper spoilage, though she fretted they could darken the mood if overused. The sisters here have read some of those ideas or learned parallel lessons by taste, and keep their recipes gentle. Historians still argue whether convent medicine represented formal scholastic knowledge or a practical craft honed by memory, but the result smells the same. Warmth, herbs, kindness. You notice a pot labeled posset, milk curdled into ale with a little heat and spice, waiting for a sore throat. Another jar holds aliberry, bread sops simmered in ale with sugar and cinnamon for the weak or convalescent. These are comfort foods you can drink, the culinary equivalent of being tucked into bed. Light joke too sidles in. If modern food delivery apps listed aliberry, served with a reassuring eyebrow, you'd order it every cold season. The infirmarian keeps a tiny ledger, less math than memory. Sister Joanna, evening fever, meadowsweet, and small beer. Widow Alice, no appetite, ginger and fennel. It isn't grand theory, it's pattern recognition with a human face. The same cleanliness that earned the sisters beer, its good reputation keeps the ward quiet. Linens boiled, jugs scrubbed, hands washed in warm water with ash lye until the clay squeaks. Clean vessels, happy yeast, and, by extension, calmer stomachs. A lay sister carries in the little wooden sign from the brewhouse. Warm for the infirmary, and props it against a jug. She turns the spigot, the stream is steady, the color a soft gold. You can almost hear yesterday's ale Connor sigh with relief that no one has to sit on a sticky bench to test this one. Callback earned. The patient sips, eyes flutter, shoulders let go. Warmth spreads like a shawl. You trace the line backward in your mind. Hop garland over the window, Cosmery on the shelf, Barm saving tomorrow's bread, and now all of it arriving in a cup that lets a body unclench. Historians still argue whether the real efficacy lay in the plants, the alcohol, the calories, or the care, the ritual itself, the being seenness that steadies a racing heart. You decide the answer is yes. The herbs matter, the heat matters, the kindness matters, the slow sips matter. The whole becomes something larger than its leaves. Light Joke 3 peeks around the door as a novice, writes a label in careful Latin. Cervisia Pacifica. Peaceful beer. You imagine a medieval commercial. Ask your infirmarian if peaceful beer is right for you. Side effects may include lower voices, easier breathing, and the feeling that the world has put a blanket over your knees. Evening leans across the ward. Shadows of herb stems stripe the whitewash. Someone snores, soft as a cat. The cup's dregs rest on a saucer, a tiny crescent moon of foam. And you, still in second person, still wandering between kitchens and bedsides, begin to understand the secret claim that nuns brewed better. It isn't a victory over monks or guilds. It's that every stage of their brewing keeps bending toward care. The same attentions that minimized headaches on market day turn into remedies at night. The same ledgers that kept sellers honest make sure the poor drink for free when fevers rise. The same customary leaf that marked psalms marks a recipe for rest. You step back into the corridor, cup warmth lingering in your palms. Down the hall, the brewmistress closes the kettle lid with a click that sounds almost like a promise. Behind you, the infirmary door eases shut on its own. The house breathes. And somewhere between prayer and practice, the beer keeps doing what it has always done here. Carry calories, carry herbs, carry mercy. You step out into the cloister garden, night dew settling on the grass, and you catch the low hum of voices that aren't prayers. It's monks, visitors from the neighboring monastery, muttering as they pass. Their tones are hushed, but their meaning cuts clear enough. The nuns' beer outsells theirs, and it stings. You linger near the shadows of the apple trees, listening. Too smooth, one monk grumbles. Too popular. Another sighs, as though excellence itself were an offense. You can't help but grin at the image of robed men secretly jealous of their veiled counterparts' brew. Mainstream fact. Monasteries across Europe, especially Benedictine and Cistercian houses, became famous for brewing on a large scale, producing ale not only for their communities but also for trade. Yet chronicles and local records occasionally remark on convents with superior recipes that drew steady customers. Historians still argue whether this superiority came from cleaner practices, fresher herbs, or simply the novelty of women brewers in a male-dominated trade. Whatever the case, evidence suggests that convent beers sometimes eclipsed monastery ales in both flavor and popularity. The quirky tidbit comes in the form of a letter fragment from the 15th century, in which a monk complained that a nearby convent's ale was too much, sought after by the people who neglect our own. Imagine the wounded pride ink-blotted harder with each grumble. You almost see the monk hunched over parchment, dipping quill too deep, while outside the tavern window of the convent, neighbors happily line up for frothy mugs. Light joke one slips in. If Yelp had existed, the monastery page might have read, "Atmosphere. Good chance. Middling beer. Try the sisters next door." You trail behind the muttering monks as they shuffle away, sandals scratching stone. Back inside the convent, the sisters are none the wiser, or maybe they are, and they just keep stirring. Brewing wasn't about besting anyone. It was about sustaining the house and the town. Yet reputation spread like foam across a fresh pour, and envy was as inevitable as bubbles. In the brew house, the kettle simmers again. The sisters laugh softly as they taste the new batch, noting a cleaner finish than last week's. You can almost feel the envy growing heavier in the monastery down the road. The monks there have resources, land, and sometimes royal patronage. But the nuns have patience, cleanliness, and herbs chosen not for scale but for care. A memory returns. The infirmary's labeled jars, the market window's careful service, the cellar's meticulous ledgers. Every step leaned into quality. You realize that what looks like superiority in the mug is just devotion in a different form. Historians still argue whether convent brewing should be seen as competition or complement to monastic brewing. Were nuns intentionally rivaling monks, or simply brewing well enough that comparison became inevitable? The records never settle it, but you sense the truth resting somewhere in between. Light joke two winks by. Picture a medieval brew-off, cloister versus cloister, judges in long robes sniffing mugs like wine connoisseurs. Hints of rosemary. Smoother finish? Point to the sisters. Somewhere a monk slams his cowl in defeat. Even the townsfolk knew. Word spread. Travelers told stories of convent beer that sat easier in the stomach, left fewer complaints in the morning. Some whispered it was the herbs, some said the care, some joked it was divine intervention. You picture a pilgrim leaning over a mug and declaring, "Clearly the Holy Spirit has better taste here." Light joke 3 rides in with that one. Holy water may cleanse the soul, but holy beer keeps the headache away. And beneath the humor lies envy that never entirely fades. You imagine monks in chapter meetings, fretting over accounts, while their lay brothers sneak jugs from the sister's window. A paradox. Rivalry in public, reliance in private. Brewing was never just about taste, it was reputation, economics, pride, and quiet victories that carried on long after the mugs were drained. You step back into the cloister walk. The air smells of damp stone and faint malt. The monks' murmurs dissolve into the night, but you know they'll be back tomorrow muttering again. The sisters will keep brewing, not to win, but to serve. And somehow by serving, they keep winning anyway. You slip into the rhythm of travel now, joining the slow shuffle of pilgrims along a rutted road. Cloaks drawn tight, staffs tapping cobbles, they move in little groups toward shrines, relics, or simply safety in numbers. Dust rises, rosaries swing, and bell towers in the distance call the faithful. And at day's end, feet blistered, throats parched, they scan for more than a hostel. They're hoping for a convent gate, a place where the ale is clean, the bread honest, and the welcome steady. Mainstream fact. Pilgrim routes across medieval Europe, think Canterbury in England, Santiago in Spain, or countless regional shrines, were dotted with religious houses that provided hospitality. Convents offered food, beds, and yes, beer, often lighter small beer that was safe to drink and nourishing enough to replace a meal. Travelers recorded the relief of such stops, even if they didn't always name the specific convent. Historians still argue whether convent hospitality was driven more by spiritual duty or economic savvy, but whichever way, it meant weary travelers drank beer made by nuns. The quirky detail? Some convents became known almost like roadside diners, famous for one particular specialty. In one case, chronicles hint at a convent near Cologne whose herb beer was so refreshing that pilgrims intentionally stretched their journey to pass through. Imagine a 14th century TripAdvisor review. Detour worth it. Excellent ale, friendly sisters, sandals dry by the hearth. As you walk with the travelers, you notice their chatter. One praises a smooth draft from last night's stop. Another recalls a convent brew that sits light on the belly. While a third brags about drinking without waking with fire in the skull. You chuckle. There's your hangover callback again, echoing from the market window into the pilgrim road. Word of quality spreads not through scrolls, but through footsteps. Light joke one stirs in. This is basically medieval Yelp on foot. Except instead of star ratings, you get calluses, and instead of hashtags, you carve a little pilgrim badge for your hat. At the next convent you reach, the welcome is simple. A lay sister ushers travelers into a courtyard where benches ring a fountain. A novice appears with a jug, filling clay mugs in turn. The beer is cool, lightly herbal, faintly sweet from barley. Pilgrims sigh, wipe brows, and lean back against stone. It's not indulgence, it's medicine for road-weary bodies. You spot a jug set aside marked with a cross in chalk. That one, you learn, is for the sickest. Quirky tidbit. Convents sometimes brewed stronger or spiced tonic ales for infirm guests. Cloves, cinnamon, or honey stirred in to ease coughing or lift spirits. These weren't everyday mugs, they were liquid bandages. As dusk settles, you hear voices lift in hymn from inside the chapel, blending with the clink of mugs outside. Pilgrims murmur prayers between sips. Some leave tokens, a few coins, or promises of future gifts. The exchange feels less like commerce and more like ritual. Beer given, rest found, blessing spoken. Historians still argue whether convent alehouses functioned as proto-inns competing with taverns, or whether they stayed strictly charitable but Standing here, you see how porous the categories are. A pilgrim's donation isn't so different from a tab at the tavern, yet the gratitude feels heavier, as if the beer itself carried a whisper of prayer. Light joke too arrives when one pilgrim, lips still wet with ale, declares, "I'll never walk past this place again." His companion groans, "That's the point. You're on pilgrimage. We must walk past." Some jokes really do write themselves. The night grows cooler and straw palates beckon. The beer, mild but filling, warms bellies without muddling minds. Pilgrims settle, some snoring, some fingering rosaries, some gazing at the stars through the open dormer. You realize convent beer did more than soothe thirst. It smoothed journeys, carried stories, and became woven into the folklore of roads themselves. Light joke 3 curls up as you tuck in with them. Medieval bed and breakfast, except the bed is straw and the breakfast is last night's leftover small beer. You think maybe that's not so bad. By dawn, the courtyard hums again. Travelers tighten straps, sling bags, and murmur thanks. One pats the wall fondly, another waves toward the still-closed window where fresh beer will soon be ladled. And you, feet dusty, shoulders sore, know you've tasted a piece of the road's secret map. The way good beer, brewed with care, turned a convent into a star on a pilgrim's sky. You wake with the pilgrim's footsteps fading into the road, but back inside the cloister the rhythm shifts again. Bells toll, sleeves roll, barrels creak, and once more the beer flows, not only into mugs but also into the convent's ledgers. You begin to notice a pattern. Every order, no matter how strict, seems to find a way to bend the rules when barrels are involved. A vow may speak of silence, of fasting, of detachment from worldly things, but exceptions bubble quietly through the froth. Mainstream fact. Many religious rules, Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, specified food and drink in strict terms. Wine was often limited, sometimes forbidden entirely in northern houses where it was scarce. Beer, though, slipped through loopholes, sometimes classified as food, sometimes as medicine. During fasting seasons when meat and even dairy were curtailed, liquid bread often filled the gap. Historians still argue whether such allowances were intentional acts of mercy or convenient reinterpretations of canon law, but the records show that beer became indispensable, especially in cold climates. The quirky bit. Some houses rationed beer not in mugs, but in daily pints, written into the schedule. In certain regions, the allowance could be astonishingly generous, up to a gallon a day. Imagine the paradox of ascetic life regulated down to the spoonful, except when it came to ale, where the measure was anything but stingy. You picture a stern prior finger wagging about discipline, before calmly noting that each sister is permitted 3 hearty servings. Light joke 1 sparkles through. If you ever tried intermittent fasting with medieval rules, you'd spend 16 hours without food, but still have 4 mugs of beer. Keto by Barrel, Cloister Edition. In the scriptorium, where quills scratch and candles flicker, a novice sneaks a sip from her jug. She's not breaking her vow, her ration was written in. But you can sense the contradiction. Austerity beside indulgence, silence beside the low gurgle of ale poured into clay. A breviary open in one hand, a mug in the other. Holiness and hops entwined. You wander into the refectory during Lent. The table is stripped of cheese, meat, even eggs, but the jugs remain, lined up in tidy rows. A sister tips one and fills 3 mugs before sliding it down the table. The drink is thicker this season, almost porridge-like, brewed intentionally strong to replace lost calories. It's not revelry, but survival. You sip and find it sweet and heavy, like drinking bread custard. Quirky detail again. Fasting beer wasn't only tolerated, it was sometimes encouraged. In Bavaria, liquid bread brewed by monks during Lent became so thick that later on, when papal envoys tasted it to rule whether it broke fasting, the beer had spoiled from the long journey and seemed awful. Rome shrugged. If it's this disgusting, drink as much as you like. The loophole was cemented. You imagine nuns chuckling quietly at the trick of distance and spoilage, sipping fresh ale with satisfaction. Historians still argue whether convents brewed Lent-strength beers or left that mostly to monks. But you picture a sister at her kettle stirring a wort that's richer than usual, muttering that it'll need twice the herbs to balance the thickness. She isn't breaking rules, she's feeding the community by the rules' own loopholes. Light joke two winks from the corner. Medieval canon law is basically the original terms and conditions. Nobody reads all the clauses until they want to bend them. See subsection 7. Exceptions for barley-based fluids. In the brewhouse, barrels bear chalk marks. Fasting ale, daily ale, guest ale. The categories feel less like discipline and more like a medieval menu. You realize the sisters weren't disobedient, they were practical. To keep vigils, to copy manuscripts, to nurse the sick, they needed fuel. And beer, safer than water, easier to store than milk, became the loophole that kept life humming. Even the silence rule bends. Officially, meals are eaten without chatter, but clinking jugs fill the void, and glances across the table say what words cannot. That this is permitted, even blessed, even necessary. You sip along, feeling the contradiction smooth itself into daily habit. Light joke 3 slips past. Imagine designing a strict austerity diet plan that comes with unlimited beer. You'd sell out in seconds. The medieval cloister did it first. You step back into the courtyard, head light but steady, and realize something crucial. The sisters weren't rebellious. They were resourceful. They found balance between rules and reality, between vows and vessels. And in that balance, beer flowed. Not as a vice, not as a sin, but as a daily necessity dressed in the clothes of devotion. The bells toll again. Vespers calls, mugs empty. Tomorrow the loophole will open once more and no one will be surprised. You carry last night's lessons out past the gate and onto the trade roads where wagons creak, geese argue, and accents change faster than the weather. What the sisters brew here isn't brewed in exactly the same way 100 miles away, and you feel it on the tongue first. Think of this next stretch as a medieval tasting flight. No mustache-waxed bartender, just a patient lay sister topping up your clay cup as the landscape rolls by. You begin in Flanders, where city walls shoulder, right up to the canals and bales of barley lean like sleepy giants against brick warehouses. The air tastes faintly saline, as if the North Sea keeps a hand on every mug. Here you learn, the move toward hopped beer hits early and hard. Mainstream fact. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Low Countries were leaders in hopped brewing, shipping casks along Hanseatic routes, and nudging neighbors to accept bitterness as preservation. Bruges and Ghent carry that reputation like a banner. The Groot of old, those herb mixes overseen and taxed by civic or ecclesiastical powers, gives ground to lupulus that holds a brew steady long enough to travel. Historians still argue whether the speed of this shift came from flavor preference or from the politics of the Grootrecht, that lucrative Groot right whose taxes funded powerful families. Quirky tidbit. In Bruges, the very word Groothuis clings to a mansion once tied to the spice and Groot trade, a fossilized street sign for the days when a handful of officials could decide whether rosemary or bog myrtle flavored your supper drink. You picture a nun from a nearby beguinage, those semi-enclosed communities of religious women, quietly comparing notes with a port broker about the price of hops from the last ship in. She doesn't say much. She doesn't need to. Her kettles speak in clean edges now. Fewer meadow flowers, more pine lean bitterness, a finish that holds like a straight-backed chair. Light joke 1 arrives on schedule. You're basically drinking a medieval West Coast, except the coast is the North Sea and nobody knows what IBU means yet. The hop garland you saw above the convent window back home suddenly feels like a passport stamp. In Flanders, the same twist of vine is less a hint and more a declaration. The batch will keep. And you notice how the nuns adjust. Hops preserve, yes, but they can tilt a beer dour if overdone. The sisters soften the edges with a whisper of fennel or a spoon of honey for infirmary jugs, reminding the palate that bitterness can travel and still be kind. You cross the rivers and climb toward Bavaria, where hills fold into darker forests and cellars run naturally cool. The beer shifts again. Sturdier grain bill, cleaner snap, bitterness that rides in a straight line and parks neatly at the swallow. Mainstream fact: Bavaria's 1516 Reinheitsgebot, the purity order, famously limited beer to water, barley, and hops. Yeast was implied later, a regulation that shaped regional flavor long after its dukes were dust. Historians still argue whether that law protected consumers, stabilized grain markets, or simply swatted at spiced competitors. Either way, coriander and other medieval seasonings become wallflowers at a party they once hosted. The sisters here brew within the rule, and the result tastes like a mountain stream dressed in malt. A cellar nun taps a cask and frowns in satisfaction at the tight, brisk foam. She prefers the colder corners. Remember the brew mistress back home who mapped her barrels by temperature? And down here, the yeast obliges with calm, tidy work. You're not quite in the age of named lagers yet, but caves and cool storage do their quiet magic all the same. Quirky tidbit: some houses mark their best fermenting alcoves with little hand-carved saints. You imagine St. Lawrence, patron of cooks and grills, assigned a corner where the fire isn't. A private joke the sisters share while choosing the chill. Light joke, too, leans into the rulebook. The Reinheitsgebot reads like a minimalist recipe card. No coriander, sister, and keep your meadowsweet in the herbarium where it belongs. By the time you reach England, the vocabulary itself changes under your boots. For a while, ale means unhopped and warmer, softer, often sweet bready from oats or wheat. Beer means hopped and imported or brewed in the Low Countries style, then increasingly at home by immigrants and adopters. Mainstream fact: late medieval and early Tudor records draw a line between ale and beer, with hopped drink arriving via Dutch and Flemish influence, and facing restrictions and local suspicion before becoming standard. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII really called hops a pernicious weed, or whether that phrase is a later misattribution, baptized by repetition. What's clear is that regulation and taste tussle like terriers for a long while. You duck into an English convent kitchen where the sisters bend toward the old ways a little longer. Alehoof to clarify, yarrow for lift, maybe meadowsweet for its almond hush. And yes, you've tasted that before. Their small beer sits soft on the tongue, like the breakfast cousin of a loaf. Yet even here, bales of hops ride inland, and a curious sister holds up a papery cone as if it's a relic. She crushes. You smell green spice, clean and sharp. The kitchen hums with future decisions. Do they keep their herb-led signature or lean into the bitter new road? Historians still argue whether women, especially alewives and nuns, resisted hops out of taste loyalty or because the shift threatened their place in the market now tightening under male guilds. Quirky tidbit: English ale conners, those official tasters you met when we laughed about sticky benches, sometimes donned thick leather breeches to test for proper body, a tale that's half science, half slapstick. Imagine him visiting a convent that's already scrubbing jugs to a squeak and boiling with monastic discipline. He rises clean, triumphant, and probably a little disappointed that there's no story to tell. Light joke 3 can't resist. Audit complete. Findings: non-adhesive. Also, excellent with cheese. By now, your tongue keeps a private map. Flanders writes in firmer strokes: pine, pith, pepper. Bavaria signs crisp and spare. England, when it clings to Groot, sketches meadow, honey, and fresh bread, then slowly inks in the hop alphabet letter by letter. And through all of it, the sisters read the room. Well, the climate, the market, the rulebook, and the infirmary, tuning recipes like a choir matches pitch to a stone nave. Regional grains tug the compass too. Barley holds court, but oats and wheat step in when weather sulks or harvests fail. In Flemish towns, a 3-grain blend might give a rounder, cloudier mug. In Bavarian valleys, barley's the law-bound backbone. In English shires, oats soften the ale like a woolen cloak over shoulders. You remember the costmary leaf tucked in your pocket? A personal bookmark for gentle brewing. Here it shows up less. There it peaks again in a bedside cup. The same herb can be a signature in one house and a cameo in another. Supply lines do their quiet vetoes. If the hop ship docks late in Bruges, a beguinage may nudge its recipe back toward Groot for a fortnight and sell through the window with a conspiratorial shrug. If a Bavarian decree tightens grain allocation after a bad harvest, the convent doubles down on cleanliness to keep thin beer honest. If English alewives bristle at hop taxes, the sisters might split the difference. Herb-led for daily, gently hopped for travelers who ask for a sharper edge. Historians still argue whether these shifts were deliberate terroir choices or simply what the cart delivered that week. The truth, you suspect, is both. Conviction wearing the cloak of necessity. You hear a bell and realize you've walked a triangle in your mouth, Low Countries, Alps, Island, without leaving the cloister's logic. Window garlands change, ledgers adjust, infirmary labels tilt a little toward ginger here, a little toward sage there. Yet the core remains what you've known since the first kettle steamed against your face. Clean water rendered safe by heat, grain softened into kindness, bitterness braided so it holds but doesn't harm, and vessels scrubbed until the clay sings. Region is accent, care is language. And because you love a callback, you glance at the revolving turn, the contactless pass-through, and picture it spinning in every place you've tasted. Flemish brick, Bavarian stone, English timber. On each sill, a nun's hand appears, steady as a metronome, presenting the local answer to the same old problem. Thirst, illness, travel, fasts, labor, prayer. The mug's shape changes. The promise does not. By twilight, you've got preferences you didn't know you were allowed to have. You'd choose Flanders when the road is long and a cask must keep. Bavaria when the day asks for clarity and a line straight down the middle. England when you want to sit in a warm kitchen and taste meadow in your bread. You smile because all three, brewed by women who count, clean, and care, answer to the same quiet rubric. Make it safe, make it steady, make it serve. The road settles. Hops rustle like paper. Somewhere a sister chalks a barrel guest ale. Another writes infirmary. A third draws a tiny cone above tomorrow's window. Whatever the map, you know how to read it now. Follow the garland, trust the scrubbed jug, and remember that the best beer you drink tonight was finished with a gesture you almost missed. A quick sign over an empty sill. Gratitude folded into foam. The cloister quiets again, but this time you hear something unusual. The clatter of brewing does not quite match the vow of silence. You lean against a pillar listening. The rule says meals are eaten wordless. The rule says gossip is forbidden. The rule says quiet clears the way for prayer. Yet brewing is noisy work. Boiling water, clanging kettles, the scrape of mash paddles, the crackle of firewood, the hiss of steam. And so you find yourself in the middle of a paradox. Silence and suds. Mainstream fact. Many monastic and conventual orders kept rules of silence broken only by sign language or necessary words. The Cistercians, for instance, were known for strict quiet with designated talking places. Yet beer making is no whisper's task. You cannot safely coordinate a barrel lift with hand gestures alone. Historians still argue whether brewing was exempted from silence formally or whether the sisters just broke it pragmatically, but evidence suggests brewing spaces always had their own hum of sound. The quirky detail? Surviving records of medieval monastic sign languages include signs for ale, barley, and drink. Imagine two nuns flashing quick hand gestures across the room. One taps her lips for drink, the other sketches a barley stalk in the air. Communication persists even in quiet. You smile at the thought. Ancient brewery charades, habits rustling, faces straight, hands a blur. Light joke one slips in. This is the medieval version of Slack. Channels muted, emojis flying, Everyone technically silent while the real conversation hums underneath. You follow a novice into the brewhouse. The cauldron roars. She hauls a bucket, sets it down with a splash, and gestures frantically for help. Two sisters grab the other side, lifting together, their sandals slipping on damp straw. Nobody speaks, but the teamwork is flawless. You feel the paradox soften. Silence isn't absolute here. It bends to necessity like so many other rules already have. At mealtime, the vow reasserts itself. The refectory is filled only with spoon scrapes and jug thuds, the occasional cough, the rhythm of psalms read aloud by a lector. Yet even here, beer is present, poured into clay mugs without comment, passed down the line like punctuation marks in a text written without consonants. You sip and hear what silence can sound like. Not absence, but rhythm. You return to the brewing hall after Compline. It's empty now, kettles cooling, fire banked low. But the room itself holds echoes. The hiss of yesterday's boil, the slap of ladles, the laughter that somehow slipped through vows. You realize that silence in convent brewing is less about shutting sound out than about choosing which sounds matter. Bells and psalms matter, gossip does not. The rush of boiling wort? Necessary noise. Historians still argue whether convent records downplay how much chatter actually happened in brewhouses. Perhaps the official rulebooks insisted on silence, while lived reality allowed for whispered jokes, for quiet encouragements, even for humming. After all, brewing is long work. A sung psalm might pass the time as well as sanctify it. Light joke too stirs with the mash. Imagine a modern ASMR channel called Medieval Nun Brewing Sounds. Just 2 hours of water pouring, fire crackling, mash paddles swishing, punctuated by a single whispered Latin phrase. You'd fall asleep instantly. As you stand among the kettles, you picture again the sign language. A raised hand for enough, a circle drawn in the air for barrel, maybe a waggle for foam. These gestures feel like a hidden choreography, a whole parallel vocabulary that let brewing flourish without breaking silence too much. Quirky tidbit. Some of these monastic sign languages survive for centuries, used even at mealtimes to request more bread or drink without speaking. You wonder how many times a sister signed ale across a refectory table, mug in hand, eyes twinkling. Light joke 3 nudges you gently. Medieval group projects were tough enough, but imagine one where your partner won't talk. Sister, I said stir clockwise. No, clockwise. 1,000 years later, students still feel the same. The paradox stays with you. The convent vows created a quiet that sharpened ears. The drip of a leaking spigot, the faint fizz of fermentation, the sigh of a barrel as it settled into its place. To modern ears, silence can feel empty. Here it feels full, filled with labor, ritual, and the kind of sound you only hear when nothing extraneous gets in the way. You leave the brew house with its doors half closed, kettles steaming like sleepers, the air thick with yeast and firewood. Outside, the cloister's silence folds back in, gravel crunching under sandals, doves cooing in the eaves, a bell tolling the hours. And you understand that silence wasn't the opposite of brewing. It was its frame, the space that made the sounds of kettles and barrels mean something more than noise. The cloister garden fades into autumn light, leaves drifting across the flagstones, and you feel the mood tilt darker. The sisters still brew, still ladle through the window, still soothe travelers with warm mugs. But outside their walls, the world is shifting. Cities grow, guilds tighten their grip, and the brewing trade is no longer just household work or cloister craft. It's becoming a male-dominated industry, organized and regulated, squeezing out women who once held the ladles. Mainstream fact. By the late Middle Ages, urban brewing guilds in places like London, Paris, and Hamburg increasingly restricted membership to men. Alewives, who had dominated domestic brewing for centuries, found themselves taxed, regulated, and gradually excluded. Convents, despite their religious authority, weren't immune to the pressure. Records show urban guilds lobbying against unauthorized brewing and pushing to centralized production. Historians still argue whether this shift was an inevitable result of scale, big cities needing industrial output, or whether it was a calculated act of exclusion against women. The quirky tidbit emerges in surviving laws. Some towns required public ale stakes or signs and fined women heavily for unlicensed brewing. You picture a convent sister frowning as a city official waves a parchment decree, insisting her garland of hops counts as an ale stake and thus falls under guild jurisdiction. It's the kind of bureaucratic nitpicking that makes you groan centuries later. Light joke one bubbles up. Imagine city inspectors running around like medieval food bloggers, stamping unauthorized ale on every barrel. Hashtag #HashGuildLife. Inside the convent, you notice the ledgers tightening. Fewer surplus barrels go out, more are held back for the sisters alone. What was once a small but steady revenue stream shrinks under the pressure of guild oversight. The townsfolk still whisper that the sisters' beer is gentler, kinder, less punishing, but buying it openly becomes trickier. And envy, the monk's muttering you heard earlier, now gets backup from civic powers. You see the lay sisters discussing alternatives. Perhaps they lean harder into brewing only for the infirmary, classifying more of their ale as medicine. Perhaps they brew smaller batches distributed quietly. One even jokes half seriously about smuggling casks under sacks of laundry. But the tone is wistful. Brewing is no longer a free field for women. It's narrowing into corridors policed by guilds. Historians still argue whether convents resisted fiercely or bowed gracefully to the change. Some evidence points to sharp declines in convent brewing after the 15th century, while other records show a few houses holding onto the craft well into the Reformation. But the trend is clear. The sisters' quiet dominance at the kettle wanes as city guilds and male brewers consolidate. The quirky detail you can't ignore. Medieval illustrations occasionally demonize alewives, painting them with devil's tails or caricatured features, propaganda to undermine their role. You imagine how that same suspicion bled toward convents, though less directly. A nun brewing might be tolerated as pious. A woman brewer in town might be painted as wicked. The double standard stings even centuries later. Light joke 2 walks in anyway. If monks had been drawn with horns every time their beer gave someone a headache, medieval manuscripts would look a lot spikier. The sisters don't rage. They adapt. You picture them pruning recipes down to essentials, brewing just enough for survival and care. Maybe they slip a mug to a trusted neighbor. Maybe a pilgrim still finds solace at their gate, but the heyday of bustling trade through the convent window fades. The alley grows quieter. The hop garland hangs less often. Still, the brewing doesn't vanish. Inside the walls, kettles bubble, herbs steep, barrels rest. For the sisters themselves, beer remains as vital as bread. But the sense of outward competition, the nuns outselling monks, the townsfolk preferring their ale, wanes under guild rules. You sigh because history so often narrows women's hands away from trades they once defined. Light joke 3 nudges gently. It's like medieval version control. Sorry, sisters, you don't have permission to push to main branch. You walk once more through the cool cellar, noticing fewer casks than before. The ledgers still track gallons, but the margins grow blank, entries sparser. The echo of bustling sales fades into the sound of your own footsteps, and yet the care remains. Scrubbed jugs still squeak, herbs still dry on the rafters. Brewing continues, but the world has stopped listening as loudly. When you step into the courtyard, the air carries both malt and melancholy. You realize you've witnessed a decline, not of skill, but of recognition. The sisters never brewed worse, they simply lost ground in the shifting economy of guilds and gender. But the memory lingers, hidden in recipes, whispered in travelers' tales, tucked like cosmary leaves in forgotten psalters. The convent gate closes, but you know the story isn't over. Beer brewed by women won't disappear completely. It will just slip underground into kitchens, into memories, waiting for someone to taste it again. The sound softens now, like steam settling after the boil, like kettles sighing into quiet. You stand where the shutters meet the stone and feel the night move in slow and gentle currents, the air warm with a sweetness you can't quite name. The garden drifts around you in mild shapes, low beds of mint, a pale thread of meadow sweet, the darker cushion of alehoof near the path, and each leaf seems to hold its breath as if listening for your shoulders to loosen, for your jaw to unhook, for your thoughts to set themselves down. You can imagine the sisters banking the fire, the last paddle wiped and leaned against the wall, the last jug turned to dry until it squeaks, and then the small tasks of closing, the latch lowered, the chalk brushed from a sleeve, the little blessing traced over an empty sill. The house grows quieter with every step, corridors deepening into calm, cells darkening, the chapel holding a soft echo that feels like velvet. Your breath begins to match that hush. In, slow as a tide, out, slower still. If a door opens somewhere, it opens without sound. If a bell speaks, it does so from far away, in a voice rounded by distance. The road beyond the wall sinks into a kind of sleep. The herb scents lengthen into something like memory, and you realize the night is doing the work now. You don't have to. The brewing will wait until morning. The ledgers will wait. The window will open again when the sun lifts its edge over the eaves. For now, the task is only this. Let the last tiny fizz fade. Let the clay cool beneath your fingers. Let the quiet choose which sounds to keep. You are held, and you can rest, and the world will keep its promise until you wake.